Hello everybody, my name is Luke Marr and this is HauteLeMode, and today on HauteLeMode we are going to be doing a video that I've actually been wanting to do for such a long time, and we're going to be reacting to the Met's About Time Fashion and Duration Exhibition Tour video. If you guys do not know, the Met Gala in 2020 was canceled very sadly. I was really upset about it. It's like the highlight of my year. Andre Leon Talley once said it was the Super Bowl of fashion, and he did not lie, but it doesn't mean that the exhibit that was attached to the Met Gala wasn't going to be presented. Obviously, Andrew Bolton, who is the curator, and the team at the Metropolitan Museum of Art did not let the exhibition go to waste, and so the exhibit started out in late October instead of early May like it was supposed to. And you know what? All the time and effort went into actually creating the exhibit. I think that it's very important that museums come back into our lives, even though there's a whole pandemic going on. If you can do it safely and effectively and everybody wears their masks and social distances, I respect it. I also will say I did get a chance to go to the actual exhibit in New York. It was actually a very lovely experience, but I wanted to react to the exhibition tour because unfortunately we won't get to see it in person together, which kind of sucks. I think that had this year happened, I might have actually been able to do like a little bit of a video inside of the exhibit. Hopefully next year, the Met. Hey, let's get something going here. That would be fun, wouldn't it? But still, Andrew Bolton is gonna walk us through this About Time exhibit. I'm very excited to talk about it. And with that, let's get into the exhibition tour About Time, Fashion, and Duration with Andrew Bolton. Before I start, also, people are saying, oh, you don't have AirPods, blah, blah, blah. I do have AirPods. They just don't work with the way that we record these videos. You have to deal with my distracting wire. I apologize. All right, About Time, Fashion, and Duration. Andrew Bolton, here he is.
Anniversary, and the exhibition reflects this time span. In essence, the show is a meditation on fashion and temporality, drawing out the tensions between change and endurance.
His mask is kind of cute. I've never seen a mask with like that small of a circumference before. That's very interesting. Is that like a Met special kind of mask? Because I'm jealous. And also I think the way that it pairs off of his glasses makes me laugh.
Is a meditation on fashion and temporality, drawing out the tensions between change and endurance.
Essentially, for the people not with big dictionary words that just float around in their head, the exhibition pretty much goes through 150 years of fashion history, for the most part within Western culture. I want to make that very, very clear. It does really revolve around the European fashion system, so it definitely does not give you a good sort of global worldview of fashion. But I will say the exhibition is very good at showcasing how, within the Western fashion system and society, styles and silhouettes and different techniques have sort of come in and out of fashion throughout 150 years, and even more so of that. And in a weird way, the exhibit sort of documents that in side-by-side pieces that allow you to draw the parallels between those two different examples.
And ephemerality and persistence. Recently, time has dominated discussions within the fashion community.
If you do get to go to the exhibit, when I was there, I have to say the clicking of this big old like moving sundial clock, it actually like makes noise where like it's sort of ticking and counting. And at one point I was so into the exhibit, I thought maybe I had like got high somehow because I was like so in a daze of like watching and looking and seeing everything. It was very, very weird. And I think when an exhibit can sort of really like draw you in that way, it transforms the experience of seeing all the clothing even more so.
And these conversations have centered around the accelerated production, circulation, and consumption of fashion to meet the commercial demands of an interconnected and digitally synchronized world.
Also, I do think it's very interesting what Andrew was saying about the sort of production aspect of fashion. When you look at the Met, which is an art museum, and the fact that sort of decorative arts, which fashion for the most part has been considered, and in a weird way, decorative arts for years and years and years was considered a lower class form of art. It's very interesting to see how the Costume Institute is definitely one of the most sought after exhibits to go to, at least when I was there. It was very apparent that you had to make sure that you had an appointment because you can't just go because everybody wants to go to those exhibits, whereas you can make an appointment to go and just see the rest of the museum, but you have to make a special appointment to actually go and see the About Time exhibit, so just to prepare you on that. But it's very interesting that fashion, to me, I want to consider it an art form always because I think like ego, I want to be like, it's an art, like this is what I do, I work in like an artist sort of world, even though I'm not an artist. I do think that fashion sort of straddles the idea of art and product together because fashion has to be sort of utilitarian for the most part. There are some really great designers, I think, that have definitely proved that fashion and fabrication and all of these sorts of styles don't necessarily have to be utilitarian. I mean, Rei Kawakubo's Comme des Garçons is a really great example of that in my opinion. But for the most part, these brands only exist because they sell clothing and like a dream, although for the most part they make money off of bags and shoes and all that sort of stuff. So maybe fashion has sort of evolved more so into a art form because it doesn't necessarily have to be utilitarian and these brands don't necessarily make all of their money off of the clothing. So like maybe that's rewriting how I think about fashion. Anyway, I do think it's very interesting that for the most part, I consider fashion a craft. I wouldn't say it is a form of art, and I wouldn't say that it's necessarily just a product. It is a craft, which to me sort of meets in the middle and compromises those two things.
But we're realizing that these demands are
Burton
having a
from Mcqueen.
Detrimental effect not only on creativity,
Balmain
but
by
also
Olivier
on the
Roustan.
environment. So we thought it might be a good time to explore the temporal character of fashion from a historical perspective. The exhibition presents 150 years of fashion culled almost exclusively from the Costume Institute's collection along two parallel timelines. The first features 60 ensembles arranged in chronological order from 1870 to the present. It focuses on the forward-moving and progress-oriented nature of fashion.
As we mentioned before, there are two pieces that are sort of turned into like little duos that sort of bounce off of each other from years past to closer years past, some may say. I can't remember what exactly these two black pleated looks are. I definitely think that this first room goes a lot more into the 1800s and early 1900s. But I will say that the Comme des Garçons black leather look, it's either Comme des Garçons or it's Junya Watanabe. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. That's a great example of it bouncing off of this half-cut shot of the Dior bar suit from the early 1940s. So in that way, these pieces definitely do allow the viewer to really see the parallel between the two pieces. Sometimes it's very evident what the similarities are. In these cases, I think it's very easy to spot. But sometimes you really do have to like sit there and sort of look at it, really try to see what's going on in the piece, which to me is sometimes hard in a fashion exhibit because the pieces are so far away. You're not really allowed to get too close to them because you don't want to breathe on them and degrade the textile. For the most part, it's actually kind of fun to see how these things match up.
That's governed by novelty, ephemerality.
I believe that one of these is a Raf Simons for Dior and it's cut out of leather. I would presume it's the one to the right. I actually don't know which the one on the left is with these little, you know, svelty black flowers and the bow waist.
And obsolescence. The second timeline intersperses a series of 60 interruptions that pre- or post-date the first timeline, but relate to them in terms of shape, motif, material, technique.
I have to say that there are quite a few fun styles that are good to see. I would say that this Iris van Herpen that's currently on the screen is a really great example, and the way that the Iris van Herpen is sort of juxtaposed against this Charles James beautiful gown does for the most part do a service to the actual parallels. Sometimes the parallels obviously in shape here is a great example of seeing those sort of similarities between Iris van Herpen and Charles James. But at the same time, when you look at Iris van Herpen and Charles James as designers, both were incredibly revolutionary at the points that they were creating. Iris van Herpen still is incredibly revolutionary at the point that she's still creating. But there is a lot of information to process if you really do like fashion and you want the history of it. But I also think the exhibit does a good job of showcasing a lot of sort of important pieces to know if you're just getting into fashion.
Material, technique, or decoration. The 60 ensembles in each timeline are primarily in black to emphasize their changing silhouettes and interconnection.
Wasn't obsessed with that, but I get why they did
it. The exhibition has been designed as two enormous clocks, with 60 illuminated tick marks that reference the number of minutes in an hour.
Yeah,
Each
that I
tick
thought was a
contains
cute
two
little
ensembles.
overview.
The front object represents the linear chronological timeline, and the back object the non-linear fragmented timeline.
I think it's important to reference when we see these pieces on screen that are so iconic, we must discuss them. One of them is that black crocodile and mink coat. Now, if you guys have not watched our Christian Dior Yves Saint Laurent video, you should. It's very important. But that is from the Beatnik collection, which pretty much got Yves Saint Laurent fired from Christian Dior, even though he had only worked there for 3 years. It's sort of like modern fashion now. There are some really great pieces in this exhibit that you wouldn't normally get to see. So when you do go, if you get the chance, if you're lucky enough, and I hope that everybody is lucky enough to get to go, it's so important to like take photos of these, really like look at them, inspect them, because some of these pieces are fucking iconic in a Western fashion sense and must be adored for their iconicness.
The front object represents the linear chronological timeline.
That's a gesquière for Louis Vuitton.
Timeline. Together, the timelines express the concept of duration as outlined by the French philosopher Henri Bergson, in which time exists as a
That's a
continuous
Vivienne
flow,
Westwood and
the
Malcolm
relationship between
McLaren.
the past and the present is one of coexistence rather than succession. And viewed from this perspective, each pairing achieves.
That is a Rudy Geinrich. I'm not super duper familiar with Rudy's work, but I do know that that's what that is. And that's paired up next to an Azzedine Alaïa zip dress. And I believe Rudy did it first, but Azzedine did it also pretty well, I must say. And then you have some sort of like Paco Rabanne sort of moment and chainmail experience next to each other, which is also super duper fun.
Achieves a kind of temporal autonomy.
Oh. That is a Elsa Peretti and Halston dress, and now that is an Elsa Peretti beautiful belt. Now, if you guys do not know, I should do a video on Halston, but Elsa Peretti was a jewelry designer who was very, very iconic, worked with Tiffany's for many, many years, but she helped and was a part of sort of Halston's like clique in the 1970s.
Through its union of the past and the present, a vision of time.
The Liz Hurley, Versace, beautiful dress with the safety pins, which was so iconic back in, what, late 80s? Yeah, very important dress. You should know that one
Free
too.
from the confines of chronology. Her writings on
look at those
time
bows. I'm not even into bows like that.
Kidman, Meryl Streep, and Julianne Moore, who starred in the 2002 movie The Hours, which was based on Michael Cunningham's novel inspired by Mrs. Dalloway. Charles Frederick Worth introduced the princess line in 1876. And the princess line was basically a one-piece dress, and it was formed without a waist seams.
If you guys ever see a sort of piece that goes from the back to the front and the seams are vertical, we talked about it in our archive video that Glare used a lot of these sort of seams that went all up and down the whole look, although he actually did create horizontal seam. So that doesn't make it a princess style, but you can see a pretty good example of that there. The princess line was invented by Charles Frederick Worth, who was commonly called the father of haute couture. And you're gonna find out a really cool, interesting fact about Alexander McQueen and his love of the princess line in a minute here.
So vertical seams would continue from the shoulders through to the skirt, which created a very form-fitting hourglass silhouette. And typically, the princess line wasn't worn with a bustle, but back interest was maintained through a series of puffs. And we've paired it with Alexander McQueen's famous bumpster skirt from 1995. And the McQueen's bumpster skirt basically is a radical reinterpretation of the princess line. He cut the skirt so low that it showed the base of the spine, but also the top of the buttocks. And McQueen felt that the base of the spine was the most erotic part of the body, both for men and for women. So Worth
I do think that aspect is very interesting, and Andrew Bolton essentially said that throughout his work studying McQueen, and I would say if there's anybody that knows quite a decent chunk about McQueen and also physically sees, touches a lot of McQueen, it would be Andrew Bolton. I mean, his exhibit on McQueen's Savage Beauty was very tremendous in a lot of people's formations of their love of Alexander McQueen. Essentially, Alexander McQueen throughout his time really did love using the sort of princess cut as a way to accentuate the body. I actually don't know how the bumpster necessarily pairs into that princess line aspect. I do know, obviously, the idea of showcasing the butt and elongating the torso was part of, you know, the bumpster experience. And I guess in that way, it probably definitely does play into creating a new silhouette, which Charles Frederick Worth sort of didn't create a new silhouette, but definitely created a new technique on how to accentuate a silhouette. So maybe that's where it's coming in that regard.
Produced the bustle in the early 1880s.
Oh my god, wait, the Yohji Yamamoto one is fire.
Coat by Yohji Yamamoto from 1986.
Oh my god, the tool.
What Yohji's done is cut away the back of the coat and inserted a poof of nylon, which has the same extension as the bustle from the mid-1880s. The early 1890s saw the introduction of the Jigo sleeve, which is also known as the leg of button sleeve.
We do love a leg of mutton sleeve over here on HauteLeMode. I do think they're very, very fun. And there are some interesting ones that definitely like come about throughout this exhibit.
You see in this dinner dress by Mrs. Arnold, who was a Brooklyn dressmaker. And we've paired it in the disruptive timeline with an ensemble by Rei Kawakubo from 2004. And it's basically comprised of two 1890s inspired jackets, one used as a jacket and one as a skirt. As you can see from the jacket, it's asymmetrically cut, so the closures are misaligned. And it's also displaced the Jigo sleeve to the center of the jacket. And the jacket, which has been made into the skirt, has been twisted around. So the Jigo sleeves are at the front and the back, almost like elephant trunks.
Rei Kawakubo, as we mentioned earlier, is a very good example of really fudging the line of utility when it comes to clothing.
So this is a riding jacket from 1902, and it was made for Princess Alexandra, Queen Consort to Edward VII.
This, weirdly enough, is a reference, both this Nicolas Ghesquière look and this beautiful sort of 19th century piece is also a reference back to the sort of height of French court dress during the time of people like Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XVI, which I think is fun that it constantly is referenced. It doesn't mean that it's always worn, because as much as I'd love for these highly embroidered and decorative styles and, you know, waistcoats to come back into fashion, I don't think they are. But it's very interesting to see that these pieces aren't even just from 1870, they're from before that, and so it's constantly sort of coming in and out of fashion. I should go this way instead.
And this particular jacket was inspired by men's formal suits, French formal suits from the 18th century. The scale of the embroidery and the ribbon work, along with the puffed sleeves, very much locates it within fashionable women's dress of the early 20th century. And we've paired it with an ensemble by Nicolas Ghesquière for Louis Vuitton from 2018. For this collection, Nicolas and his design team came to the Met to be inspired by our 18th century formal menswear. And again, he's combined both historical and contemporary details. Instead of embroidering the floral,
it's not embroidered.
And it creates a kind
oh,
of
I didn't know that.
that seems to be computer generated. He's also styled it with a pair of athletic shorts, which suggests a sporty ease, very, very atypical of...
That was a great Vuitton collection.
So we're jumping ahead 25 years in the timeline to 1927, and the chemise dress, which created a very planar, tubular silhouette.
It's so funny to watch the idea of Virgil's sort of quotation styles, which I know a lot of people dislike, but in a weird way, it's sort of very Virgil, and it's sort of very, it makes sense. It definitely speaks to a time. It definitely speaks to a group of people and what they like and what they want to buy. And it's almost like so obvious that it's not obvious, but it is obvious. And then you compare this sort of style to Chanel's little black dress, and it makes sense. And you can see, weirdly enough, the fabrication is totally different. The idea of the drop waist of the 1920s is definitely there, whereas Virgil's is a little bit more form-fitted and what looks like a little bit more of a stretchier, athletic-y sort of fabric. It definitely is a fun sort of nod between the two, which I think is smart.
This is an example of Gabrielle Chanel's little black dresses, and it's arguably the dress of the decade, if not dress of the century. And typical of her very modernist aesthetic, she combines both formality and informality and softness and severity. And we paired it with a dress by Virgil Abloh for Off-White from 2018 with little black dress in quotation marks. The idea of looking at sort of ordinary objects and elevating them to the level of art. And in this particular case, he's used the little black dress really as a wry gesture, as an homage to the enduring appeal of Chanel's little black dress. So we're jumping ahead in the timeline again to 1938 with a ensemble.
This is actually kind of fun. I do love the Schiaparelli, and I mean, Kim Kardashian's recent look is definitely, but it's interesting to see Yves Saint Laurent and Elsa Schiaparelli, who were both designers that referenced and utilized artists as sort of inspiration and as collaborators. I constantly think of Yves Saint Laurent's Claude Leland, sort of crazy breastplates made out of gold, and that definitely is a reference for a lot of designers that are still sort of creating these breastplates now, which they're coming more and more into fashion. I mean, Tom Ford, Schiaparelli, Olivier Rousteing personally is my favorite one. It's so interesting to see that, again, there is this sort of really smart little detailing of referencing two designers that both are revolutionary in these ways, whereas Elsa Schiaparelli worked with Salvador Dali very, very heavily in the 1930s. It's not just about the silhouette, it's also smartly woven in the way that they created clothing too.
Ensemble by Schiaparelli. In the mid to late 1930s, evening suits comprising a decorative jacket and a long skirt or dress became very fashionable, and they were popularized by Schiaparelli. In this particular one, she's used two broken mirrors, hand mirrors, to frame the breasts of the wearer.
Oh,
The
wow.
inspiration actually came from the salons of War and Peace in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. It was made just before the war, so these broken mirrors took on the symbolism, almost they became talismans, I suppose.
Before she
of
was
hope
a
and courage and even
Nazi
determination for the
collaborator,
war that was to
Elsa.
come. And we've paired it with a ensemble by Yves Saint Laurent. It's called his Broken Mirrors jacket, and he's used the back of the actual jacket as one frame.
Is that stitched?
The mirror is made from silver foil that he's fractured with crystals and outlined in gold foil. You know, he felt that Schiaparelli's clothes lent self-assurance and confidence to the wearer, which is also traits that you see in this particular piece.
It's so great that this video exists, I just have to say, because you do really get to see these pieces in up-close detail, whereas when you're actually at the exhibit, that's not necessarily the case, unfortunately.
Harper's Bazaar in 1943 commissioned the dressmaker Bertha Black-Lurie to reconstruct a late 1920s man's tailcoat. So this is actually originally a man's tailcoat from 1929.
Wow.
And we've paired it with a tuxedo by Martin Margiela, who's known for upcycling. In this particular piece, he's used a man's tuxedo and oversized it instead of refitting it to the female forms. So it's actually a resizing of a man's tuxedo rather than a refitting of it.
Again, it's sort of so smart that these pieces are really paired against each other in these ways. I will say, when you go to the exhibit, it's not as clear why these things are always paired against each other, and that's my one gripe with the Met, is that they do have little plackets that say, you know, this is a Margiela from 1989 or whatever, and this is who gave it to us, but I do think the Met would benefit from actually putting little plackets that explain sort of correlation between these pieces and why they're important. I do think it will give more information and context to a lot of people, which I think would be really, really cool and really, really smart. And that's my one thing that I hope the Met does in the future, is give more explanation as to why these things are so important, because I wouldn't have really put those two things together. And like, I'm not trying to say that I'm some crazy fashion, you know, historian, icon, legend, star, but if I couldn't put those things together, I don't think just a regular person off the street who's trying to get into fashion and learn about it would pick that up either, unless they're really smart, in which case, like, bully for you, proud of you, go off.
The second half of the exhibition, we've jumped forward in the timeline to the 1960s, to 1968. The 60s saw a reprise of the chemise silhouette from the 1920s.
See? Gernreich. Rudy Gernreich. And the Azadine Alaya.
And this is an example by Rudy Gernreich. The only decoration you see on the dress is a zipper that starts on the back of the neck and spirals around the body to the hem. Very similar to Charles James's taxi dress from the 1930s. And he named it the taxi dress because he liked the idea of a modern woman undressing in a taxi. And this dress had a similar sort of feel for quick, speedy dressing or undressing. And we paired it with a floor-length version by Azadine Alaya from 2003. And again, the sole decoration is a zipper spiraling again from the top of the bust to the hem. Alaya began experimenting with zippers around the 1980s. In this particular piece, he's used it almost like an integral seam to trace, but also to enhance the contours of the body. So this dress dates to the same year as Ray Kawakubo's deconstructed dress, but it couldn't be more antithetical to her poverty deluxe aesthetic. It's made by Karl Lagerfeld for Chanel, and it was actually his first couture collection for Chanel in 1983.
Oh, wow.
And it references the heritage of the house with this trompe l'oeil jewelry.
If you don't know, we talk about this all the time, but costume jewelry was a Chanel classic and still is to this day.
That references the costume jewelry that became part of Chanel's signature. It was embroidered by the House of Lesage with very intricately with
Mise en
beads
Lesage.
and pearls and crystals. But the actual necklace serves as structural as well as a decorative detail. It's actually a halter neck, so it actually supports the weight of the dress. And we've paired it with a dress by Sarah Burton for Alexander McQueen from 2019. And it's basically a hyperbolic interpretation of Karl Lagerfeld's dress. She used a very simple shift dress and embroidered it with a field of crystals. The inspiration actually came from the chandeliers from the gilded ballrooms in Blackpool in the north of England.
Something that's very interesting about Sarah Burton's McQueen, which is a trope that I think she has brought into the brand and during her tenure at McQueen, is these sort of little tchotchkes. They sort of come in and out of collections, and I think these sort of what look like drop earrings and these quite fanciful embroidered styles is a great example of it. And in a weird way, it definitely plays off the trompe l'oeil of this Chanel dress, but she's never really afraid to reference, you know, the United Kingdom and Ireland and its sort of ancestral history, and I think she's a very good example of Western fashion brands that should continue to do that. Stop taking from all different continents that you know nothing about, that you have no right to go in and sort of colonize. There's a lot of great sort of textile developments and inspirations that come from places like Europe. Why not use that as a reference? It's what you know.
It was where Sarah was raised. So we've jumped again ahead of the timeline to 2006 with this piece by Undercover, Jun Takahashi. Takahashi is very influenced by Ray Kawakubo and Martin Margiela's deconstructivist aesthetic and very unconventional techniques. In this particular piece, he's used vintage tuxedos
Wow. I didn't
and
even
ripped
see
off
that.
the sleeve and left the seams unfinished. And he's wrapped them around the body end to end, almost like a straitjacket. We've paired it with a much more refined example of a designer reinterpreting the tuxedo. This is Christian Dior from 1949. And like Takahashi, Dior has taken components of the tuxedo, in this particular case, the silk file lapels and the cummerbund, draped it around the waist. Instead of confining the body, he's buttoned the silk file at the back and left it to fold gently around the ankles of the wearer. So two very radical reinterpretations of the tuxedo.
I love that.
This dress is by
Iris Van Herpen.
It dates to 2012.
I always say Iris, but it's really Iris,
Iris
so
is
I
innovative
apologize.
use of 3D printing technologies has very much placed her at the vanguard of fashion. So this dress was inspired by the artist Philip Beasley's installation, Hylozoic Ground, which you can see in the biomorphic silhouette.
It's so nuts. I do love an Iris Van Herpen.
The bodice, the very fitted bodice, contrasts with the skirt, which has which is all made out of layers of plastic PVC.
It's almost like
which have been
tentacles.
Initially laser cut and hand applied, but it gives the feeling of a living organism. And we've contrasted it or paired it with a dress by Charles James from 1951. As you can see, the soft puffs of the skirt very much reference these lobed effects of Iris Van Herpen's dress. James was well known for refining endlessly his designs.
He also was quite a provocateur. He was kind of low-key a bitch, too, in the most loving way, but was one of the most revolutionary designers of the 20th century, no doubt. We talked about a lot of Charles James's looks when we did our review of the Met Gala that took place in reference of Charles James, but it's always nice to see a Charles James, especially one that's in like such beautiful condition. Like that garment looks like it just came out of a box, and it does not look like it's from the 1940s, 50s, 60s.
And this particular design was originally conceived in 1941, but it reached its greatest extension and the most hyperbolic form in 1951. Which
also, he was very phallic. Like, I love the fact that man just he loved a penis in multiple ways, and he loved to turn a penis on its head and put it in a dress, too.
See here. We end the exhibition with this piece from Victor and Rolf's Spring 2020 Haute Couture collection. which was a direct response to the temporal acceleration that's come to define fashion in the 21st century. And like many designers, Victor and Rolf have begun to embrace conscious creativity and move toward slow fashion with its emphasis on value and quality and longevity. Since 2016, Victor and Rolf's haute couture designs have been produced with surplus fabric from past collections.
Also, you can see even in the way that it's sort of quilting that's collaged and overlapped and mismatched, that idea of upcycling of fabrics and upcycling of garments into, you know, a more modern sense. And so in a weird way, this is actually a great piece to see the forward-thinking future of fashion.
For the Spring-Summer 2020 collection, they created a series of patchwork dresses from their archive of fabric swatches. And this dress is made up of samples of floral and geometric lace. It celebrates handcraft and shared labor, and its simple silhouette recalls the pre-industrial era. And we ended the exhibition with the dress because the patchwork design seems to serve as an apt metaphor for the future of fashion and the importance of community, collaboration, and sustainability.
Well, that is the end of the exhibit reaction video. I'd love to know your guys' opinions. Anybody that's been to the exhibit, I'd love to hear about that experience as well. What you thought, what you felt like it was missing, what you felt like it did really, really well. And for those of you that are not gonna be able to go see the exhibit, tell me some pieces that you saw in the video that you love. I'd love to hear about it. Also, I will say, I did buy the book, because usually the Met exhibits come with a book. And in my fashion book review format, I will say it's beautiful for pieces, garments, styles, and, you know, pictures of these pieces. I don't necessarily know if it does as great of a job explaining why these pieces are significant in history and the differences between the two of them. So take that as you will. If you're looking for a really gorgeous coffee table book, I highly recommend this one. It's stunning. But if you're looking to really like get a whole lot of information about the garments involved in this exhibit, I necessarily wouldn't say this is exactly the book to do that. Again, I want to say thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you guys in the next video, and TTYL.